Well, hello dear comrades, and welcome back to this new episode of this podcast on Slowdown by Kōhei Saitō. We resume our close reading of the fourth chapter, Marx in the Anthropocene. In the first video on this chapter, we've argued that Marx's relevance in climate change is to start with his notion of the commons. In the second episode, we've seen how wrong it is to call Marx a productivist and a Eurocentric, that he eventually abandoned those views and the progressive view of history. But won't that mean that he doesn't believe in communism anymore? If you remove productivism and you abandon the progressive view of history, how can you sustain communism except the kind of communism that Marx himself already ruled out since 1844? Isn't productivism the only way to avoid crude communism? But we also argued that productivism isn't a solution either, so what do we do? Well, this is where it gets interesting, because it turns out that communism can have a genuine liberation and freedom without productivism. So we're not trapped between crude communism on the one hand and Soviet-style communism that is destructive to the environment on the other. There is actually a third way, which Saito calls the new face of Marx's communism. Indeed, if you just stop at the abandonment of the progressive view of history, that doesn't help very much, does it? We need to outline what kind of communism is going to replace the traditional one, so we cannot say that Marx changed his mind and just stop there. We need to go further, like Saito says, pointing out that the late Marx rejects the progressive view of history is itself no longer a new revelation, as experts have been doing this for more than a decade now. As previously mentioned, Marx had also made his anti-colonial views clear in the latter half of the 1850s, and from that point on continually stressed the importance of anti-colonialism to anti-capitalist struggle. If Marx's late period shift in thought over almost 20 years' time, including such intense research into word communal forms, consisted merely of the abandonment of Eurocentrism and the adoption of a multilinear view of history, that would be rather unsatisfying, wouldn't it? So yeah, Saito argues that we actually don't say anything new by saying that Marx changed his views, especially through his studies on Russia, because that wasn't a secret. It's already known among Marxist scholars, at least since the 1960s. In note 92, Saito mentions the 1983 book, Late Marx and the Russian Road, edited by British sociologist Theodore Shannon, and it's a compilation of essays on Marx's late writings on Russia by Shannon and three other sociologists, Derek Sayer, Philip Corrigan, and Japanese sociologist Haruki Wada, who says in the introduction of his essay that in Japan, ever since the 1960s, scholars were deeply interested in late Marx's views on Russia. It also has a biographical note on Marx after 1867 by Sayer and one on the Russian scene by Jonathan Sanders. But most importantly, it was Marx's correspondence with Zasulich, the letter as well as the drafts. So it also has that correspondence. By the way, that letter was already known to exist since at least 1911, along with its drafts discovered by David Ryazanov himself. It's the guy who created the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow, and he also initiated the first mega project in 1927. So the book contains also an introduction to the letter written by Ryazanov in 1924 about how he discovered the drafts and about how the letter to Zasulich was forgotten for a time, even by Zasulich herself, apparently. So the book also has other pieces of writings on Russia, like the second preface of the Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto, which we discussed last week, and other stuff like a few writings of Narodniks like Chernyshevsky. Again, we mentioned Chernyshevsky last week, and I think at one point I mispronounced his name and I said Chernyakhovsky. So Chernyakhovsky, that's another guy actually. That's another guy. That's a Soviet soldier during the Second World War, so don't confuse them. I know that I said Chernyakhovsky last week, but I meant Chernyshevsky. So anyways, this is all to say that it's not a discovery to say that Marx's late writings clearly indicate a shift in his thinking. What will constitute a discovery, however, is to see the implications of such a shift in Marx's thought on communism. That is, what vision of communism we are going to be dealing with through this the shift. So that's what Saito argues is missing from these scholars. Saito says that even Anderson, the scholar we've discussed at the end of our last episode, the one who praises Marx for abandoning, Eurocentrism and his focus on worldwide communes, even him, he didn't grasp what it actually meant for communism to abandon productivism and Eurocentrism. So like Saito says, we need to go further than just stating Marx abandoned the progressive view of history and ask, what does it mean for communism if Marx no longer advocates Eurocentrism and productivism? Is there a form of communism that lacks these two features and still be called communism? So we need to ask what insights came to Marx after he changed his views on history and progress. So according to Saito, this is the actual novelty that no scholar before him had explored. When we read Marx's letter to Zasulich, his later writings, and his notebooks on natural philosophy, on chemistry, agriculture, biology, etc., one has to notice that there is an ecological shift in Marx's thought. But up until now, scholars have just went as far as to say that Marx shifted his views on Eurocentrism and productivism, while others simply claim that he became ecological. But no one actually combined these two studies together and asked what it means for communism. For Saito, however, once we understand all of these elements together, this shift means that now communism becomes degrowth communism, which he believes is what Marx embraced at the very end of his life. And so this is the new face of communism. So let's see how we get there. So this new communism adopted a new view on history with two new features. We said that the progressive view of history has two main features, productivism and Eurocentrism, and so this constituted the essence of Marx's early communism. Marx's late communism, however, embraces a view of history based on two other features. Saito writes, his research into ecology and the communal societies of non-Western and pre-capitalist world was absolutely essential to construct his new vision of revolution. So there are the two new essential features of this new vision of revolution or of communism: ecology and non-Western and pre-capitalist communal societies. From these two features, Marx developed his notion of metabolism even further. History now moves through metabolic interactions between man and nature, and as such, ecology becomes central to communism. Now, metabolism, as Saito says, became a new theoretical axis of Marx's thought, and such a radical change of views leads someone into, having to rethink a lot of things, even having to get into fields of studies one has never imagined he'd get into. And so the notebooks of post-Volume 1 Capital were about that. That was Marx going hard into ecology and communal forms to the point where he never finished Volume 2 and 3. You know the story. Engels was urging Marx to complete the remaining volumes since 1867, but Marx died like 16 or 15 years later, and he had 16 years to finish the two volumes, and he never did. And it was precisely because he wanted to learn as much as he can about communal forms and the natural sciences. So that's what delayed so much the completion of Volume 2 and 3. So it's not like in the traditional interpretation of that period that Marx was plagued with various illness, and that's why he immersed himself in seemingly unrelated topics as an escape from the hard work of completing Das Kapital. It was, that period was basically seen as leisure reading, but that's not true. That's not what it was. Those studies were actually sketching the foundation of his new form of communism, of degrowth communism. So like we did last time, we started by showing the intrinsic relationship between productivism and Eurocentrism. Here we are going to do the same with ecology and communal, non-Western and pre-capitalist societies. So let's start with his research into the communes. like we said, this started with his encounter with Fraze's book, Climate and the Vegetable World Throughout the Ages, which, to remind you of its content, argues that climate is as much important, if not more important, for agriculture than soil fertility. Therefore, Fraze argued that it was changes in climate that caused civilizational collapse, because changes in climate can make it impossible to cultivate food. And so these climate changes that occurred in Mesopotamia, in Greece, in Egypt, were the result of human activity, meaning that man-made changes don't have to be, caused by CO2 emissions, but they can be done in primitive ways by, for example, over-harvesting forest land. That's when you clear forest land to make room for arable and pastoral land. And so this led Fraze to conclude that cultivation, when it progresses in a primitive way and is not consciously controlled, it can leave deserts behind it. And this is how Marx summarizes Fraze's conclusion in his 25th March 1868 letter to Engels. So if you have a progress in agriculture, like, empires do progress, because in empires productivity needs to rise a lot. If you do that without a conscious control of your agricultural practices, without the knowledge of climate and basically everything that comes into play when you cultivate land, then you are heading towards ecological catastrophe. Fraze, however, points to how other civilizations, they didn't collapse because of their alternative ways of cultivating the land. He took interests in, and I'm sorry because, again, I'm going to mispronounce it because it is a German word. So in English, this is the Mark Association, or the Mark Village, and in German it is the Mark Genossenschaft. Mark Genossenschaft. I hope that I pronounced it right. So anyway, so he took interest in the Mark associations of ancient Germanic peoples who had control over production. So they were a large group of Indo-European speaking tribes who lived in parts of Northern and Central Europe in ancient times. They lived in areas of what is now southern Scandinavia, northern Germany, and parts of the Netherlands and Denmark. So their languages, the language evolved into German, English, Dutch, Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, and Icelandic. And so among them, you had the Vandals, the Saxons, the Angles, who will later dominate England, the Franks, who will take over France, the Lombards, the Cheruskis, or the Cheruski, I think. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Is it Cheruski or Cheruski? Anyway, so Cheruski, I'm going to say Cheruski. So these were the tribes who defeated Rome at Teutoburg Forest in 9 CE. And you also have the Marcomanni tribes who fought against the Emperor Marcus Aurelius between 166 and 180 AD. And no, the Marcomanni doesn't have anything to do with the word Mark association. So Mark in the Mark association, in Mark Genossenschaft, it simply means unity, whereas in Marcomanni, Mark means border. So the Marcomanni literally means the men who live at the border. But perhaps the most famous of these Germanic tribes were the Goths, later split into the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, who played a major role. If you know a little bit of Roman history, they played a major role in the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the emergence of medieval Europe. So they're best known to history because the Romans encountered them and they fought them. They often fought them. They fought them a lot along the empire's northern frontier. Anyway, so according to Fraze, these tribes had sustainable farming practices which spared them the same road to destruction that other civilizations took. Survival then depends on sustainable farming practices. And so what were these practices? Well, Saito gives accounts based on Fraze, but also on another German historian, contemporary of Fraze, Georg Ludwig von Moder. And so this guy wrote a book. I don't think there is a translation of this book in English, but so the book's title in English is History of the Village Constitution in Germany in 1865. And this guy also was an influence on Marx. And he describes the Germanic practices as follow. These Germanic peoples owned land communally and had strong rules regulating production methods. It was unthinkable within the Markgenossenschaft to sell land to anyone outside the community. Other products like timber, pork, wine, and the like were also forbidden to be bought and sold outside the community. So that's Saito, who summarizes Moore's views from the book itself. In footnote 93, he mentions the book and page 313. And there is, as I said, there is no translation in English, but we know that phrase quoted Moore, although from another book, but about the exact same thing, mentioning the exact same passage. And the title of Fraze's book, from which he quotes Moore, is Introduction to the History of the Mark, Court, Village and Town Constitution and Public Power. I'm not going to try to say the title in German. I just translated it through Google Translation, but that book is from 1854. And oddly enough, Fraze also quotes from page 313. 313. And Saito quotes Fraze quoting Moore in this book, in his book, Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, which we already did a whole episode on, explaining it, not reading through it. And so on page 264, so Saito quotes, he quotes Fraze quoting Moore. And so it says, if the Mark village did not allow sales except among village members of wood, straw, dung, and even livestock like pigs, and also ordered that all the crops harvested within the village and even wine should be consumed within the village, out of this practice various soccage rights were to emerge. The means must have been retained for the maintenance of land power and furthermore the use of additional nutrients from forests and pastures, and even the use of meadows mannered by rivers served to increase the soil's power everywhere. More page 313. So, these practices, they basically... sorry. So these practices, they basically mean that everything from production to consumption must take place within the village and the community. So at first glance, these practices, they can seem a little bit arbitrary and especially tribalistic. They seem to have a certain discrimination towards outsiders, but that's not really the point here. It's not that we have to do exactly the same practices as the Germanic tribes and we form closed communities that don't let in outsiders, but to understand that sustainable agriculture needs communal ownership of land and strong communal relations and regulations. It is precisely regulations as these that not only they cause no changes in climate, but also they give enough time for the soil to renew itself. And as a matter of fact, Saito says that such practices, they can actually cause some changes in the soil, but changes that actually improve its fertility. So he says this sort of strong communal regulation supported the renewal of the soil and enabled sustainable farming practices. It even brought about long-term improvements in soil fertility. It was a very different arrangement from those of ancient civilization that had weakened these sorts of communal bonds. And of course, it's the complete opposite of agribusiness under capitalism, which includes the extraction of nutrients from the soil in order to make money selling crops in large urban centers. So clearly here, the fact that you cannot sell anything produced on the land of the village to outsiders means that you restrain from increasing the productivity of the land. What the village community produces stays within the community, and as such, nutrients extraction never exceeds the capacity of the soil. But that requires, like we said, a strong sense of affinity with the soil and the community members. the more sustainable your farming practices are in the long term, the more fertile the soil becomes. It seems that a sustainable agriculture cannot be separated from a strong communal ties to the land, and so this is Maurer and Fraze's most important insight here. In civilizations that take the form of huge empires, or when land turn into capital for agriculture, for agribusiness, these communal bonds, they seem to get weaker. And once these bonds are weakened, the regulation of the land commonly owned is disrupted, and this leads to unsustainable practices. So this shows the irony of how, these tribes are often depicted in history, like the Germanic tribes during the reign of the Caesars, were often portrayed as backward, barbaric, violent, and uncivilized. Saito mentions Tacitus, the Roman historian who lived from 56 to 120 AD, who is known for his histories and the annals, and who made an account of the history of the Germanic people in his short ethnographic work written around 98 CE, Germania, where he depicts them as such. In it, you will find statements such as they don't have cities, probably because they don't know how to build, they are lazy, their kids are filthy and live among their flocks. You cannot distinguish between the master and the slave. They don't drink in moderation. They always fight among each other and they cannot unite, etc. Especially in paragraph 33. The whole work is just divided in 46 paragraphs called chapters. He says, for example, in paragraph 33, that it's a good thing that they always fight and kill each other because they are not only doing us a favor, they also give us a show. And he also says that women are treated almost as equals in political matters. In paragraph 8, for example, Tacitus, he writes that women are listened to in council and their responses are never dismissed, and they hold women in such respect that if they are captured, they are completely demoralized. But this is taken as a sign of decadence by Tacitus, especially at the end of paragraph 45, where he mentions the tribe of Sutones who are ruled by a woman. Not sure if it's Sutones or Sutones, not sure of the pronunciation, but he says that by the simple fact that that tribe is ruled by a woman, they have fallen too low, so that it's not from freedom that they have fallen, but from slavery. Like, if you are ruled by women, your freedom is smaller than the freedom of a slave. Now, it is true that Tacitus also points to some of their virtues. There are parts where he portrays the Germans as inferior, but in a Rousseauian manner. So Rousseauian manner means that he portrays them as noble savages rather than inferiors in need of civilization. It's also a moral mirror for Rome, like the Germans' primitive virtues like courage, simplicity, loyalty are contrasted with Roman decadence. Like, he praises their like he says that they are morally superior in some ways. He contrasts their simplicity, courage, and moral rigor with what he sees as Roman decadence, Roman excess, and corruption. So he praises their strict monogamic traditions too. Like, there are a few things the Romans can learn from the Germanics, but only from a moral perspective. But it's mostly for women, by the way. Like, Tacitus says that Roman women should learn from the Germanic women to be more discreet, to avoid allurement of public shows or the stimulant of feastings, to avoid any temptation of adultery or clandestine correspondence with men. That's in paragraph 29. And as for men, he admires their strength and courage, but they have no sense of moderation. Even when he speaks of how they eat, he mentions that their feasts are always simple in paragraph 23, unlike the Romans who have to always go hard and display shows with luxurious food. But then that's immediately contrasted with how the German men cannot handle their booze. So even when he recognizes some good aspects of their society, he immediately downplays it by saying that it's just because they're ignorant of evil. For example, in paragraph 26, the one where you have his discussion of how they manage land, for example, he says that in that paragraph, he starts that paragraph by talking about money, I think. He says that they don't have money and they don't have, the practice of interest. Like when I lend you some money, I ask that you give it back to me with interest. Tacitus seems to think that money and interest are the root of evil, but he doesn't say that the Germanics are good for not having them, even the practice of interest. For the Germanics, you borrow like $100, you give me back $100. There's no interest, and so Tacitus, he says that like money and interest, they are the root of evil, but he doesn't say that the Germanic are good for not having them. He simply says that the absence of those practices is just because they are ignorant of them, which is a better safeguard than prohibiting such practices, according to Tacitus. So this echoes the Eurocentrism we criticized also in early Marx. When Tacitus describes the way they manage land in paragraph 26, he contrasts this with how Romans do agriculture. So he says that the land proportion to the number of inhabitants is occupied by the whole community in turn, and afterwards it is divided among them according to rank and need. The arable lands are annually changed, and a part is left fallow, and they only seem to produce corn. They don't use land, although it is very fertile, like the Romans, for planting orchards, for enclosing meadows and watering gardens. And like I said, in various paragraphs, he calls the Germanics lazy, even though he never makes the connection between their laziness and agriculture. You can kind of suppose that he's advocative for a productive use of land. Rome is better, more advanced, because Rome is efficient in its land use. It produces more and in variety, because Romans aren't, lazy bums. But such views see progress as a matter of power and productivity increase rather than sustainability. But if sustainability was the standard for progress, then it is the Romans who would be the real barbarians, not the Germanic tribes. Anyway, so to go back to Marx, he started to study the Germanic tribes as well through Fraz, along with other pre-capitalist and non-Western nations, because he now sees the importance of sustainability. Marx immersed himself in all of Fraz's writings. The ecological viewpoint evident in Capital led to a growing interest in the sustainability of communal forms in pre-capitalist societies. So going back to Moore, since it was Moore's book that formed the underpinning for Fraz's work on the Marx Association, then Moore too would have the socialist tendency that Marx attributed to Fraz. As a matter of fact, Marx's letter to Engels, the 25th March, states, it starts with praising Moore and his book for giving a new look on history. Because you see, Marx in that letter says that human history should be like paleontology. It's just compiling. It's not just compiling events in a linear fashion, or like in the progressive view, having to fit those events in a positive evolution. Instead, we look at history. When we look at it, we should do it like a paleontologist's look at fossils. Fossils of extinct creatures, they lie buried. They are often invisible or unintelligible to observers. Only later, with the right perspective and tools, can scientists reconstruct the life forms and ecosystems of the past. History should be like that. We go to the distant past and we are constructing it with the most modern tools and techniques. But we do so because social, economic, and political structures of the past still exists in plain sight. So, not really like fossils, but it's to point to the limit of highly intelligent contemporaries who often fail to see their significance. It's like Gramsci's notion of archaeology. He talks about the archaeology of society, digging beneath the surface of contemporary social and political life to uncover the structures, practices, and mentalities of earlier epochs that persist in transformed ways, like how old social formations survive and influence the present, shaping culture, politics, ideology, etc. So Marx's point about history being like paleontology is very similar to this. Historical forms, like communal landholding, they lie hidden in the past. They are often overlooked by contemporaries, but they contain the roots of modern developments like socialism. Like we have what we needed all the time buried in history, and yet it was so close right in front of us. Like all this time we've been sitting and shitting on those archaic ways. We dismiss them as primitive, when in reality what we are looking for was there in those forms. And he contrasts this with reactionaries, like those who react against the French Revolution and Enlightenment by wanting a return to medieval and romantic values, etc. But socialists react in a different way. A reactionary is someone who doesn't go back enough into the past. Socialists, on the other hand, they should look beyond the Middle Ages into the primitive age of each nation. That's what Maurer does when he goes back to the Germanic tribes. And that's what Marx calls a socialist tendency, the same that he finds in Fras. It's to do this paleontologist method and unearth communal property. And here Marx says that the men who thought of themselves as learned and modern, they are often surprised to find what is newest in what is oldest. In the letter he says that they suffer from judicial blindness. Now, judicial here doesn't just mean what's related to justice, to law and legal regulation. It is meant in that fashion, as in the legal system is only focused on private property, and as such it dismisses forms of communal property, but it can also have a simpler meaning. Someone who is judicious means someone who is good at making judgments, like he's smart, he's well-read, etc. He's referring to this irony of when people think of themselves as smart, but because they are actually smart, they don't suspect that the best novel ideas can be found in what they view as archaic. You know, of course, the Germanic tribes and the Russian communes or the Indian villages have nothing to teach us, so why should we bother? But like we said, this new face of communism that Saito talks about is actually grounded in the oldest forms of social arrangement. And not just that, but Marx says that these old arrangements are still among us today. Like villages that are still carrying the practices of the Germanic tribes, they still exist in Marx's time. He even quotes from Tacitus, without the concept of course, and says that, for example, when he says about the Germanic tribes that they don't live in cities, meaning that they don't lay out their villages with buildings connected and joined together, but each surrounds his dwelling with a strip of land. Marx says that there are communities today in Germany, Denmark, and Scandinavia that still live like that. So he urges the German jurisprudence and economics to take interest in those communal forms, to see that communal property is not just a reality, but it's actually more desirable both socially and ecologically than private property. So Marx, by reading Maurer, not only finds that the communal villages of the Germanics are more egalitarian, they also guarantee a better ecological management of the soil. So Saito writes the following about Maurer. Markgenossenschaft involved not only communal land ownership that allowed everyone to cultivate the land equally, members of the commune also regularly exchanged plots of land to work, each allotment being decided by lottery. Maurer draws attention to how this allowed them to avoid a situation in which the most fertile land belonged to only part of the population, thus preventing unequal wealth distribution. This arrangement provides a stark contrast to the landifundia of ancient Rome, vast estates presided over by nobles who managed them using slave labor. So here we have a contrast between the Mark association and the landifundia or also called the latifundia. It's a Roman term for a large great landed estates for agricultural products destined for, for sale, just like grain, olive oil, or wine. And as you can guess, these weren't communally managed but belonged to rich individuals who have slaves working on them. And on the other hand, the Mark Association doesn't have slaves, or rather, servants and slaves were also considered members of the community, and they work on the land with their masters. And they were, assigned small parts of land to cultivate for their own subsistent needs. Also, land distribution changes regularly, and each receives the land that they'll work on by lottery. And as such, no monopolies of the most fertile land can form, which avoids disparities in wealth distribution. Also, if we refer to Tacitus among the egalitarian aspects of the Mark Association, we find the role of women in council and politics. So, besides the prohibition to sell land to outsiders, or to anyone actually, since private land ownership isn't a thing there, and it regularly rotates, this is something else the judicious man should look at. So not just selling land and selling products for members outside the community, we also have equal wealth distribution, equal contribution from both genders. And here Marx says something very funny. Saito writes about such egalitarianism unearthed, dug out by figures like Maurer, who was ironically a conservative. That it is a form of egalitarianism practiced by the same Germanic barbarians who struck fear in the hearts of even the socialists of Marx's time. So in note 95, he also refers to that same letter by Marx to Engels, where Marx mentions that the socialist tendency of finding what is the newest in the oldest makes equalitarians like Proudhon, for example, shudder. So the socialists here are Proudhon and his followers. This is important because in Marx's time, most socialists weren't communists, but they were close to Proudhon's ideas regarding property. Now, we all know the famous La propriété, c'est le vol, French for property is theft. So that's from Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. That's his famous assertion in his work, What is Property? Qu'est-ce que la propriété? And Marx took interest in Proudhon, but he grew, extremely critical of him because although Proudhon rejects private property, he only meant large-scale property by that. And as such, he embraces an ideal of petit bourgeoisie, like small bourgeoisie. Small-scale peasants and artisans, each having their own property, what he calls possessions. So in other words, Proudhon starts by positing a universal individual that has his own plot of land on which he works, and therefore he rejects communal or collective property. He opposes what he saw as authoritarian communism. For him, equality had its limits and total communal ownership was undesirable. He's more of a libertarian, if you want, and he also wasn't very fond of gender equality as well. We will go back to Proudhon in a few weeks, or I think it's going to be next week. Anyway, but we are going in a few weeks. I think that we are going to discuss Proudhon in length in the 7th chapter of Slowdown. But yeah, we will go back to Proudhon. But as Marx says in his letter, Maurer and Franz, they completely refute the petty bourgeoisie's ideal of socialism. In another letter from March 19th, this time, same year, 1868, Marx even praises Maurer for refuting once and for all the narrative that the Germans settled each by himself and only afterwards established villages, districts, etc. In such line of reasoning, the starting point is private property. Someone shows up on the land not owned by anyone and says, "This is mine," and he can claim legitimacy on it as long as he works on it. Then he can associate with others to build, villages and districts, etc. But Maurer says that at first there was not a private property, but at first there was a communal property. Private property only arose later, and this socialists like Proudhon, they didn't like because of its radical egalitarian implications. So now we have a new basis for communism. Its conditions are sustainability and social equality, which go hand in hand. You cannot have a sustainable agriculture or relation with the earth without social equality and vice versa. And as such, we can say that these ancient tribes that Marx studied with close attention were practicing primitive or indigenous communism. So the term indigenous communism appears in Capital Volume 3 in the last paragraph in chapter 48, the Trinity formula. Now that chapter is made of fragments that Engels found in Marx's manuscript, and he grouped them together. And the paragraph Marx discusses indigenous communism, it breaks off at the end. So that communism is contrasted with economic mystification, because right before it, Marx discusses how in capitalist societies, the agents of production, now the people making production, they see their reified economic relations as natural laws governing them irrespective of their will. And so this is economic mystification. When you take the economy and the social structure and social relations it creates as the natural state of the world, like the capitalist mode of production starts with this mystification of the economy. It sees itself not as historically determined, but as universal. And so such mystification doesn't appear in indigenous communism, according to Marx, because what it requires first is that relations are organized through value instead of use value. We've explained the distinction between value and use value in our episode on Marx's eco-socialism. So in the Germanic tribes, production is predominantly oriented towards use value for the producer's own needs. In capitalism, or early forms of capitalism, production is predominated by value as such, unrelated to concrete needs. Also, this mystification doesn't really appear in Middle Ages because slavery or serfdom forms the broad basis of social production. Like Marx already pointed out in the Middle Ages, serfs still had a communal connection to the land, which made it difficult for value as such to arise. However, feudalism differs from indigenous communism because it is not egalitarian, and therefore it's not the community that is the basis of production, but only the servile community. In indigenous communism, Marx notes two things. First, it's the actual community and its conditions that present itself as the basis of production. So production is made and decided upon by the community. This implies a certain structure of the community that doesn't turn into a hierarchy, let's say. So for the community to be the basis of production, the conditions to have a community like that in the first place is also part of the basis of production. Those conditions are equality, and we can also add freedom in the kind of developed communism Marx aims at from indigenous communism. So in order for the community to be the basis of production, it must be egalitarian. In other words, Marx could have said that in indigenous communism, the actual community and its egalitarian condition presents itself as the basis of production. And the second thing is that the reproduction of this community is production's final purpose. The communal ownership of land means survival of the community and its egalitarian structure as well. And as such, it is oriented towards the community's needs and sustainability. The community must therefore sustain itself through a sustainable management of the land. And as we've seen, this requires egalitarian structures among the members of the community. So Marx comes to a fundamental understanding for communism. Sustainability and social equality were intimately linked. This is the real reason why Marx began to study non-Western and pre-capitalist communal forms alongside his research into ecology. The Germanic peoples treated land as shared property. It belonged to no one. They prevented monopolization of the blessings of this land by the few, by dividing the land equally among everyone, by avoiding the individual hoarding of wealth. Domination and subservience were prevented from arising among the members of the commune. At the same time, because the land belonged to no one, it was protected from overuse by a single owner. This guaranteed that the land was used sustainably. So there you have it. There is an intrinsic link, an intimate link between social equality and sustainability. You don't want to fuck up the land that you depend on, and so it must be shared property. It must belong to no one. It must never give rise to monopolies. Otherwise, it's directly headed towards overuse. Marx argued that it's not that there are many people on the land that leads to overuse of land, but when only a few own it. It is when there is exclusion from land use, it's when people find themselves landless that overuse and plundering of the land becomes a threat. So this now becomes Marx's new goal. Foster this intimate connection that inoculated these communes against capitalism, but on a bigger national and international, even global planetary scale, to pave the way for these communities to transition directly into real communism, one that isn't confined to small-scale and isolated communities. Because so far, our discussion of the Marx association resembles crude communism, where individuality and individual flourishment and freedom still seem absent, but already have their latent conditions. All that is required is the tool to bring them out. So this is where we need to go back to Marx's letter to Vera Zasulich. If you remember from last week's episode, Zasulich asked Marx if it is necessary for Russia to embrace capitalism if it hopes to transition to communism. So she framed her request as a life or death question because, given how harsh life conditions were in Russia, it won't be affordable for Russians to wait centuries for capitalism to take root in Russia by the establishment and the spread of private property and develop productivity enough to transition to communism. If you remember, Marx's response was no, the Russian communes, they already have what they need to make the transition towards communism because they're basically like the Marx associations of the Germanic peoples. Again, the communal life of the Germanic isn't communism. Indigenous communism isn't what Marx is aiming at. He's not saying let's go back to candlelights and sleeping with flock and sheep. He is saying that indigenous communism forms the basis on which we make the transition towards communism. So in the first and third draft of the letter, he mentions more study of the Germanic tribes. Though Saito will only mention the third draft, but Marx basically says the same thing in both. After all, they are drafts of the same letter. So his argument is to draw a parallel between the Germanic Mark villages and the Russian communes. In the third draft, he says the prototypical commune, the agrarian commune, la commune agricole in French, embraces the Russian commune, and its equivalent in the West is the Germanic commune. And Saito sums it up by saying the archaic communes still extant in Russia are of the same nature as the agricultural communes found in Western Europe in the form of the communal arrangements of these Germanic peoples. So in other words, Marx says that in the agricultural, rural, or agrarian commune, we still find the essential elements of the archaic communes, and hence it carries within it the potential to transition to communism. I put the emphasis on still extant here because it's important. In the second argument of the first draft, Marx says that many think that the dissolution of the commune is inevitable to transition to communism, that you absolutely need to negate communal property, establish private property, and then negate private property again. So if this is true, then it means that communes shouldn't exist alongside progress, but that isn't the case. Like he tells Zasulich, Russia at that time was making use of machinery, of steamships and railways without having to go through the Western-style incubation of mechanical industry. This means that instances of technological development are happening without following the path of developing private property and the accumulation of capital. Also, Marx is pointing at how fast machinery of exchange, like banks and credit companies, are making their way into Russia when it took centuries for Western Europe to have them. So clearly, it doesn't seem that capitalism is necessary to have technology, and since this technology is rising in Russia while it still has the communes, then obviously the communes don't need to disappear for technological progress. The fact that communes still exist means that they don't have to dissolve. And as we have seen last time, Marx came to the conclusion that if they dissolve, it would actually become almost impossible to transition to communism, either through capitalism that emerges within then, or through colonialism like in India or Ireland. If indeed, despite that, the commune isn't fulfilling the people's needs, it's not because it lacks capitalism, but because of the hierarchical and exploitative nature of the Tsar's regimes. So the public debt and the expenditures of the state at the expense of the peasants, Marx says that if these expenses had served for the further development of the rural commune, then you would have your transition. And as such, if Zasulich hopes for a regeneration of Russian society, it is the commune that is the clement in this regeneration. And it is an element of superiority over countries still enslaved by the capitalist regime. So those are Marx's words. Capitalist countries are enslaved while Russia is the one closer to freedom precisely because it didn't dissolve its communes yet. So Marx is telling us to embrace the agricultural commune because it still carries the archaic formations of the ancient tribes. And here again, Marx argues in the first draft that the word archaic shouldn't scare us. And he takes a quote from the American anthropologist Lewis Morgan's 1877 book, Ancient Society, which is the new system to which modern society is standing will be a revival in a superior form of an archaic social type. So that's what Morgan writes in Ancient Society. Now, to be clear, the rural commune isn't, the archaic commune. It's the final term or last period of the archaic formation. As a matter of fact, the archaic commune of the Germanic tribes no longer exists. Like Marx says himself, this commune perished in the midst of never-ending foreign and intestine warfare in Europe, and so the commune of the archaic type had already ceased to exist. In the first and third draft, Marx makes three distinctions between the agrarian commune and the more archaic communities. First, he says, archaic communes, they rest upon blood relations, so no one may join unless they are a natural or adopted relative, and so these communities have the structure of a genealogical tree. By contrast, the agrarian commune was the first social group of free men not bound together by blood ties, which makes it more capable of adapting and expanding and of undergoing contact with strangers. And also, in the third draft, Marx has removed a phrase right after he wrote that primitive societies have a genealogical tree structure. In the original, he added, by cutting the umbilical cord which attached men to nature. So this is something important to keep in mind, that the move from primitive, archaic commune to the agrarian commune, when communities no longer form on blood relations, it's seen as severing the connection to nature. We will come back to this. Second, there is a difference in housing. the house in the agrarian commune and its surrounding yard belong to an individual farmer, which means that in this arrangement there is an emphasis on individuality. The individual as separated from the rest of the community starts to appear in the form of owning his own house. In archaic communities, housing was collective. We had communal housing and collective habitation, and this is believed to be the mode of habitation of tribes before the introduction of agricultural or pastoral life. So it's mostly a nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle. But Marx points that in agrarian communes, although a house is considered to be an individual property, it can periodically change owners. Thus, personal usufruct is also combined with communal ownership. And such arrangement for Marx can be the synonymous of an archaic community still transitioning to an agrarian one. And third, the same principle happens to land and work. In the primitive communes, work was done in common, and after a portion had been set aside for reproduction, the common product was distributed in accordance with consumption needs. In the agrarian commune, each receives a plot of land, he works the fields allocated to him on his own behalf and privately appropriates their fruits. However, the cultivable land is still considered an inalienable and common property in the sense that, like houses, it is periodically divided among the members of the agrarian commune. So this already resembles the communes described by Tacitus, and that's because it is. The Mark Association was already an agrarian commune, it wasn't the archaic commune. And even when the Germanic tribes came to conquer Italy, Gaul, Spain, etc., the archaic commune was already gone. Perhaps, as Marx says, it died a violent death, that the transition from the archaic to the agrarian is a deeply violent one. But if we have to summarize the differences between the two communes, it's that in the agrarian commune, the individual as a separate entity starts to emerge. Therefore, here you do have the separation not just from the community but also from nature. Man starts seeing himself as separate from the rest, both the social order and nature, and as such the agrarian commune becomes sort of dualistic. This is where Marx brings in that dualism that we mentioned last time, where now the commune can go down two different paths. Either it follows the one of the severed individuals and goes down the path of feudalism, then private property, and so capitalism, or it goes back to its primitive and archaic communal arrangements. That one doesn't seem to happen historically speaking. Whether the individual emerges, the only way forward seems to be private property and a dissolution of common property. And so this antagonism between the individual and the social seems to end with the thriving of the individual, which ironically simply leads to authoritarianism. Since the key factor of private property was fragmented labor, we have the source of private appropriation, which gave rise to the accumulation of movable goods such as livestock, money, and sometimes even slaves and serfs. So private property is, in Marx's words, the dissolver of primitive economic and social equality. It introduces heterogeneous elements into the commune, provoking conflicts of interest and passion liable to erode communal ownership of the cultivable land and then of the forests, pasture, waste grounds, etc. So once converted into communal appendages of private property, these will also fall into the long run. So if we now have to understand communism's objective, it would be to rescue common property of the archaic commune, but while preserving individuality, making the two interact harmoniously, if you will. It's basically recovering that relationship of blood ties, but on a larger scale. It's about treating outsiders just like one treats his own kin. It's to be, a distant individual while maintaining also a metabolic interaction with nature, etc. That's not an easy task, because even the agrarian commune is now disappearing. The agrarian commune is the only one still carrying those communal practices of the archaic communities, And so Marx says that its latest development was the agrarian commune described by Tacitus, but after that it fell out of sight, disappearing in the midst of constant warfare and migration. But it still exists in Russia, and that's why it is important to stress that it's supposed to give hope, because if Marx now holds the view that it is through the commons that we get to communism, if they go instinct, then it is game over. Capitalism has won, and we are just doomed to see it eat its way through the planet. And yet Marx also says something else, that even though through the history of Europe the Mark villages have disappeared, they are still existent. And he is thankful to Maurer in the letter because he managed to reconstruct the archaic prototype of the commune through the few social forms that still carry it. So even though the Germanic tribes have gone extinct, Marx says that their natural vitality or viability, depending on the translation, vitality is still around. Saito writes viability, but in the translation he refers to the one in Shanin's edition. It is vitality. That's why we need history to be like paleontology. Now the communal life and property is still here underneath the social structures of the modern agrarian commune. He refers to the commune that supplanted the agrarian primitive commune. It was out of those new communes that Maurer was able to reconstruct the archaic prototype of the Germanic tribes. Saito quotes from Marx's third draft: "The new commune, in which cultivable land is privately owned by the producers while the forests, pastures, waste ground, etc. still remain communal property, was introduced by the Germans to all the countries they conquered. Thanks to certain features borrowed from its prototype, it became the only focus of popular life and liberty throughout the Middle Ages." So like Marx says, these new communes are scattered examples that survived all the vicissitude of the Middle Ages and have maintained themselves up to this day. He even says that some villages have preserved such lifestyle of the ancient Germanic tribes in his own home region of Trier. Like Saito resumes Marx's views on the Mark village's natural viability. He says the natural viability of these agricultural communes is very strong. While other sorts of communes disappeared with the vicissitude of constant war and migration, agricultural communes survived until the Middle Ages. Marx points to the survival of shared ownership of forest and farmland in the Trier district in his home country of Germany as a trace of German tenacity. So I'm not sure how to pronounce Marx's home district, if it's Trier or Trier, or I don't know. So anyway, so this is how it is spelled. You can go check how it is pronounced and hopefully remember, because I did check how it is pronounced, but I forgot. So that's what progress now means for Marx, a revival of the archaic, of the liberty, equality, and fraternity of the ancient gentes, but in a superior, more rational, more scientific form. So what does he mean by this? Well, the rural commune can develop the technological techniques needed for its development towards real communism without going through modernization via capitalism. That was his answer to Zasulich. If agricultural communes were left in their original form in Russia, the transition to communism could take place there based on their power. If he ever said that we have to go through capitalism to get to communism, that's because he was talking about countries who have already dissolved their communal property. In his letter, he tells her that in Europe, we don't have common property anymore. We had a private property, which then became capitalist private property, and for a reminder, the petty bourgeoisie wants to return to the private property before capitalist private property, but as we've already seen, that's not a viable option either, because it just doesn't make sense. So if Russia still possesses its communal form of property, it needs not to modernize itself through capitalism, but can do it directly towards communism. Again, we insist in Marx's change of perspective regarding the necessity of capitalism. Now he argues that capitalism is purely destructive. It disrupts that natural vitality or viability. That's not a term to mean that the Germanic tribes had some sort of vitality in their blood or anything. Natural vitality is simply what is necessary for a society to thrive, because he's talking about its metabolic relation with nature. To have a natural vitality means to live accordingly to a metabolism between you and nature that is sustainable, that doesn't cause a metabolic rift. Natural vitality is simply that life in an environmental sustainability. It is to live ecologically. Private property sets the path towards an increase of productivity, because by severing the bonds between the community members and nature, it demolishes any conception of a limit. The individual, as now a separate entity, doesn't accept that he himself can be limited by something else. It's in this sense that he becomes an abstraction himself. Marx then wants to ground that individuality back into the community and the material world, because not because he wants to demolish individual freedom, but because without recognizing social and physical limits of the world, that freedom will destroy itself, since it destroys both the world and society, the two things that it actually need to exist, meaning its conditions. And as such, capitalism cannot bring true liberation. Therefore, it cannot bring progress, but like Saito says, it only brings the irreversible destruction of the natural environment and the devastation of society. So capitalism thus destroys the very things needed for a good life. This argument demonstrates the large shift that had occurred in Marx's view of history, as well as at that point against both Eurocentrism and productivism. Here's another quote from Saito to summarize that. Marx recognized that raising productivity under capitalism doesn't necessarily lead to the liberation of humanity. Indeed, it disrupts and eventually creates a rift in the metabolic link between humans and nature that forms the base conditions for life itself. Capitalism does not bring about progress towards communism. Rather, capitalism destroys the natural viability necessary for society to thrive. But by contrast, the Russian communes, the Mirs, and the Marx Association do not create a metabolic rift between humans and nature. They are therefore sustainable practices and thus have the potential to foster freedom and individuality. As Saito says, Fraz and Maurer assert that the Marx Association, Marx Genossenschaft, as a form of social organization mediating the metabolic link between humans and nature, fostered more sustainable and equal relationships between people and nature than later forms of organization. In this sense, though its productivity was comparatively quite low, Marx Genossenschaft was in fact superior. So there we again find the praises that Marx now gives to non-Western and pre-capitalist communal forms, even claiming them to be superior to those enslaved by capitalism. So yeah, this is going to require some time to adjust Marx's theory of history in Das Kapital, since the whole foundation of his theoretical framework was revised. Such a fundamental rethinking of his conceptualization of history must be incorporated into any new writing Marx produced to complete his magnum opus. So it necessitated further research into non-Western and pre-capitalist communal forms, as well as into the natural sciences with a focus on ecology. So Marx's studies of the communes of non-Western and pre-capitalist societies wasn't on a whim, but because he was really trying to overcome Western capitalism. So far in this episode, we just talked about the Germanic tribes and Russian communes, which some can still consider Western societies, but he also says the same regarding India or Native Americans. Marx studied through Maurer and Morgan the Iroquois societies, as well as even considered the Redskin hunter closer to the men of the socialist future as more humane and liberated than clerks in cities. And concerning India, we've already touched on what he said in the letters draft about it last week, that in the East Indies, the same kind of agricultural rural commune that emerged in Germanic form from a more, archaic type, it emerged there too from a spontaneous development. We also pointed to how he came to understanding that the invasions of the English, far from increasing productivity, simply managed to spoil indigenous agriculture and to swell the number and intensity of famines. His conclusion is that capitalism is, like we said, purely destructive, and thus warns Zasulich against its dangers. He even goes as far as stressing its irrational nature. From the first draft, in the paragraph he quoted Morgan, he says this, and so this is Saito quoting, "Today, capitalism faces a social system which, both in Western Europe and the United States, is in conflict with science, with the popular masses, and with the very productive forces that it generates, in short, in a crisis." Okay, so let's just correct something, because there is a mistake in the quote, either from Saito or his translator. The quote we just read seems to say that capitalism faces a system that is in conflict with science, so it's not capitalism that is in conflict with science, but another system that capitalism has to face. So this framing is kind of wrong, and that's because of the word capitalism in the quote. It's between brackets, meaning that it replaced a word in the original quote. So that word was it. If you go read the passage quoted from the first draft, it will say, "Today it faces a social system in conflict with science." Saito, by replacing it by capitalism, implies that it refers to capitalism. And that's a mistake, because in the draft, it refers to the Russian commune. So its true meaning is, today the Russian commune faces a social system in conflict with science, which is capitalism. So Marx started the paragraph as an argument in favor of the maintenance of the commune, saying that not only it is contemporary to capitalism in the West, meaning that it is still standing when normally it should have disappeared, and capitalism doesn't seem to be destroying it yet, completely at least, but it can also make the use of the technological progress generated by capitalism without embracing capitalist logic or the social system that is capitalism. Marx insists that this social system has become the arena of flagrant antagonisms, conflicts, and periodic disasters. It is always in crisis, and as such, it must be nothing but a transitory system of production doomed to be eliminated as modern society returns to the archaic type of communal property. If the commune enters such a state, its crisis will only be over when that social system, when capitalism is eliminated. But Saito gets the meaning right. He made a mistake in replacing it by capitalism, but he actually meant to say that capitalism is in conflict with three things, which is what Marx meant. Capitalism is in conflict with the popular masses, obviously, since it exploits them, with the very productive forces that it generates. The productive forces are both the workers, since it increases their productivity, but as we just said, it exploits them. But it's also the same for technology and the natural world. Capitalism is in conflict with technology because it appropriates that technology instead of democratizing it, making it accessible to everyone, which is its purpose. It locks technology to just itself and makes it only serve its profits. In other words, it liberates productive forces by creating technology. Now we have the potential for to foster creativity, flourishment, and no longer having to worry about satisfying our basic needs. But capitalism limits that technology. It wastes its potential. And so it does the same with the natural world. It can also unleash the productive forces of nature, but only to exploit it, like it does to the workers and the masses, and it keeps those forces only to itself while plundering nature of its resources. And lastly, and this is the most important thing, it's in conflict with science itself. Now, what does he mean by this? Well, This idea that capitalism is in conflict with science had a different interpretation than the one Marx meant by the Marxist-Leninists. They gave it a productivist meaning. In conflict with science was taken to mean that capitalism doesn't unleash enough productive forces, that more productive force is necessary to further spur development and the eventual revolution. For Marxists, science determines us into engineering the socialist society. Since history is essentially progressive and getting more rational through the ages, meaning that it becomes more scientific as it unfolds through time, the point of science is to bring about communism. Whatever system that halts this progress is therefore deemed unscientific and against science. Now, since this is the progressive view of history speaking, which still considers capitalism a necessity, it also embraces productivism. The stronger the productive forces, the closer we get to communism. Since capitalism is getting us closer to that, but at the same time halting us like an asymptotic curve. You know, when you look at a graph and sometimes there is a curve that gets closer to the axis but it never touches it. That's what capitalism does. It gets us closer to communism but never gets there. And what is more ironic is that the closer it gets to it, the harsher it becomes and the harder it is to, reach that final step, that transition. So the conclusion is that capitalism also fails because it falls short from the necessary increase of productive forces to spur the revolution. It doesn't unleash those forces. It knows that it will. It doesn't unleash the forces that it knows will overthrow it. But since science forces us to transition to communism, since only communism is a rational state of being, therefore capitalism is anti-scientific because it goes against science. Okay, capitalism goes against science because it doesn't unleash enough productive forces to transition to communism. So the only way to overcome it is to liberate even more productivity, to increase even more productive forces to overcome the crisis caused by capitalism. So more concretely, the crisis of capitalism is that it makes it possible to have unlimited abundance, but refuses to actualize that potentiality, thereby obstructing people's chances for liberation and freedom. The Leninists take the irrationality of capitalism as a productive force that can create unlimited abundance so that no one has to live below decent living standards, but refuses to do it, preferring to use its force not to abolish inequalities, but to increase them. And indeed, the idea that we can have unlimited abundance would make completely obsolete the fact that inequalities exist. Capitalism is in conflict with science on that point. It can produce unlimited abundance, but it chooses not to. Now, this doesn't mean that you will find writings by Lenin or other Leninists that explicitly take that sentence from the Zasulich letter draft, and interpret it that way. As a matter of fact, Lenin, who exchanged letters with Zasulich in 1903, never commented or mentioned her exchange with Marx. So this idea that capitalism is in conflict with science, as interpreted by the Leninists, comes from another work by Marx, the 1975 critique of the Gotha Program. So, critique of the Gotha Program, sorry. Donc, critique du programme de Gotha in French, because, I think in French. The critique of the Gotha Program, where you have the famous slogan, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And as Saito says, it's for this reason that Marx's famous definition of communism from the critique of the Gotha Program, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs, was interpreted as a call for unlimited productivity to produce unlimited abundance and thus solve the problem of unequal distribution. So we have to discuss that work and that slogan. So it's a critique of a socialist program initiated by two socialist groups, the SDAP, the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany, and the ADAV, the General Germans Workers' Association. This program was formulated after these two groups met at a convention in the German city of Gotha, and the SDAP, they are called the Eisenachers, I think that's how it is pronounced, Eisenachers. It's spelled Eisenachers, because they were formed in the town of Eisenach, or Eisenach. I'm not sure of the pronunciation, so sorry. Again, pronunciation, always. So the SDAP, the Eisenachers, I don't know. So they are mostly Marxists, while the ADAV are called Lassallians because their leader is Ferdinand Lassalle, who is a moderate reformist. So in 1875, the two socialist factions decided to merge into a single party, the SADP, the Socialist Workers' Party, and they produced a draft for a program that leaned heavily towards Lassallian ideas, like state aid to cooperatives, a vague call for the free people state, and concessions to nationalist sentiment. And when Marx read the draft, he didn't like it. He was appalled by it. He thought it was theoretically confused, politically dangerous, and watered down socialist principles to please the Lassallians. So he wrote the critique as a private letter to his close collaborator, Wilhelm Brach, and was published. It was published after Marx's death in 1891, after Engels' approval. So it is a quite short critique, about 20 pages long, and in it you have many Marxist ideas that inspired the Leninists, notably the dictatorship of the proletariat. So you also have the distinction between socialism and communism as the two phases of communist society. Like socialism is the transition between capitalism and communism. You also have the production and distribution of social goals, Proletarian International, and the Party of the Working Class, etc. So basically, Marx criticizes the idea of the free people's state by Lassalle, who demands for state aid to workers' cooperatives. Like Lassalle, as a reformist, he doesn't want to overthrow the state, but wants the state to be neutral, that it doesn't just side with the ruling class. He's basically asking for a democratic state. And so this, for Marx, is just naive reformism that encourages illusions about the neutrality of the capitalist state, and he mocked the phrase "the free people's state," as if there can always be, as if there can be, such a thing as a free people's state in a class society. If you have a class society, the state is never. First of all, the people is. The people are never free, and neither is the state. It's always an instrument of class rule. So socialism, as simply a more democratic form of the existing state, is not an option, and instead socialism shouldn't be a more democratic form of the state as it is, but a dictatorship of the proletariat. But he argues that it is a transitional form that will wither away as class distinctions disappear. In this transitory state known as socialism, inequality still exists, but is slowly getting eradicated. It exists because in such a state, society still bears the birthmarks of the old society, by which he means capitalist society, where distribution is according to labor. You contribute labor to the common production, and you get back the equivalent value in goods after deduction from communal needs, public services like education, health, infrastructure, reserves, etc. So Marx imagines this via labor certificates. They record how much work you've done and allow you to withdraw goods of equal value from the common store. But inequalities persist because even if everyone is paid according to labor time, people have different capacities. Some work faster, some slower, some are unable to work fully due to, they are unable to work fully due to age, health, etc. And so the reason behind this isn't an abstract value like merit, but because society's productive forces are not yet abundant enough to give freely according to needs without risking shortages. But as the proletariat takes over, the productive forces develop further towards their rational full potential and are no longer restricted by capitalism or scarcity. Productivity has advanced to the point where material abundance exists. The old limitations of scarcity have been overcome, so we now live according to the distribution principle, not according to the labor principle anymore, which is from each according to his ability and to each according to his needs. So here people work according to their natural talents and capacity without coercion or material incentive tied directly to labor time, and goods and services are freely available according to individual needs. No rationing by labor time certificates. So without the risks of scarcity, class distinctions disappear entirely. The state as a coercive power withers away because there are no antagonistic classes to repress. The material conditions of abundance make it possible for everyone's needs to be met without calculation and without engendering scarcity. So yeah, Marx does write that after the production forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, and it is only then that we can move to communism's higher stage, where class society is completely abolished, and get to that slogan of, from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. But the increase of productive forces and abundance don't have to mean productivism. Lenin interpreted the critique of the Gotha Program in that perspective. In his fourth section, the higher phase of communist society, of chapter 5 about the withering away of the state, in his work The State and Revolution, Lenin literally makes Marx say that communism is something that gets out of capitalism, with an emphasis on the get out of. Thing is, Marx never says that the increase of productive forces or the abundance that he talks about emerges out of capitalism. Nowhere in the critique he says that that communism or the productive forces, the increase of productive forces and the abundance, etc., must emerge out of capitalism. That's all Lenin's interpretation. This means for Lenin that the increase of productive forces isn't meant in a way that is outside of capitalism, but comes from within capitalism. So by that he means that we must make more of what capitalism does. Lenin takes the progressive view of history to its extreme. Communism is literally just the capitalist productive forces made global and democratically managed by the workers themselves. Abundance here means plundering the soil. It means heavy industry. It means the Anthropocene. Communism then becomes just a higher stage of the Anthropocene. Like capitalism simply doesn't produce enough or doesn't increase the productive forces enough to get to communism. And here the problem of productive forces and abundance is that it is strictly taken in its material sense, and therefore it becomes easily refutable. In note 101, Saito mentions the Marxist analytic philosopher G.A. Cohen, his book from 1995, Self-Ownership, Freedom and Equality, where he summarizes this Leninist view of Marx But even he attributes it to Marx. So it's in the fourth point of the introduction. Now, Kōhei is kind of critical of this view that you need unlimited abundance and increase of productive forces. The issue is that he attributes it to Marx. So his main criticism is that Marx makes two assumptions, one optimistic and the other pessimistic. The optimistic one was about unlimited material abundance, and the pessimist one was about the social possibility to have equality within scarcity. Like for Marx, according to Kōhei, as long as there is scarcity, class society is inescapable, and therefore all discussion of justice and distribution is futile. The only point for a political movement must be to overturn class society. As long as class society exists, equality will always be a myth, will always be in inequality, and whenever there is inequality, there is exploitation, horrible living conditions, unfulfilled potential, suffering, death, conflict, etc. And the only way out of this seemingly Hobbesian state of affairs is unlimited abundance. Marx thinks like this, you have scarcity that leads to class society, which leads to inequality, and the only way out of class society is to replace scarcity to replace it with abundance. But since the very structure of class society doesn't want to dig its own grave, it has to be dismantled by force, by a revolution. There is no other way to get to abundance. In other words, he was so uncompromisingly pessimistic about the social consequences of anything less than limitless abundance that Marx needed to be so optimistic about the possibility of that material abundance. It was not only a sufficient but also a necessary condition of equality. Anything short of an abundance so complete that it removes all major conflicts of interest would guarantee continued social strife. So Kōhei summarizes this view as the following. He says, the achievement of Marxist equality, according to the Gotha Program, is premised on a conviction that industrial progress brings society to a condition of such fluent abundance that it becomes possible to supply what everyone needs for a richly fulfilling life. So, when that's achieved, there would be no point for competing anymore, I mean competition for resources, but there will always be competition in art or athletic contests, for example. It is just, that there won't be a class society or a division of labor anymore. So like I said, Kōhei is critical of this view. His criticism is that first, Marx believes that only the proletariat can bring communism, and he says that the proletariat needs four characteristics. One, being the producers on whom society depends. Two, being exploited. Three, being with their families, the majority of society. And four, being in dire needs. The issue with that is that today, no social group can have the four characteristics together, and therefore the proletariat can no longer be the agent towards communism. As such, socialists must therefore settle for a less dramatic scenario than a revolution, and they must engage in more moral advocacy. What he means is that instead of wanting a scarcity-free society, socialists should find a way to reach equality within scarcity rather than abundance, and that is by making moral demands so that inequalities serve the less well-off. He's basically using John Rawls' argument that sometimes inequalities can be good for the worse off, while equality can make everyone miserable. And the most miserable, they can make them, even worse. Although there are differences between Kōhei and Rawls, but we're not getting into that. Now, the point is for Kōhei, if we aim at equality, it cannot be through a lowering of living standards until everyone gets to the same level. That would just mean making everyone equally miserable. But we cannot have everyone enjoy the same lifestyle as not even the rich but average Westerner, because he's aware of the ecological catastrophes that it would be. So Kōhei too rejects the prediction of abundance because of the ecological crisis. But he also says that the Western way of life cannot be sustained for very long, even if it's just for a minority. So no one can have the Western lifestyle, which requires a lot of fossil fuel consumptions. So we cannot bring everyone to the same level, we cannot make everyone adopt the Western lifestyle, and he knows the Western lifestyle is unsustainable even for a minority. The only way then is to strive for equality, but within scarcity. So basically he rejects both of Marx's assumptions. We can either share his optimism about material possibility, nor share his pessimism about social possibility. Marxism thought that equality would be delivered to us by abundance, but we have to seek equality from a context of scarcity. Now, yes, we can share Cohen's criticism about abundance and productive forces because of their ecological impact. We've been doing so far through the whole book. But again, Cohen is thinking of the Marx of the Communist Manifesto and the German ideology. So the 1840s Marx, the one who was a productivist. But when you take the late Marxist thought, you'll see that productive forces and abundance actually have another meaning. Very different from the one that Cohen is working with, because it comes from, Lenin's interpretation. That's what we'll see next time, actually, in the next chapter, because it's going to focus on scarcity and abundance. But for now, we see that when Marx says that capitalism is in conflict with science in the Zasulich letter, it doesn't, because it doesn't foster abundance or doesn't release the full potential of productive forces. That actually means the opposite of what Cohen and Leninists take that sentence to mean. What he means is that capitalism opens metabolic rifts. As Saito says, Marx argued for neither limitless growth nor infinite mass production. The science with which Western European societies are in conflict is none other than the science focused on the world's environment as practiced by Liebisch and Frase, namely ecology. So that's what he meant. Capitalism is in conflict with ecology, with the natural sciences, with the soil, the climate, the biosphere, etc. So communism does the same thing as ecologists, shaking the foundations of any justification for capitalism because of its destructive nature on the planet. To quote Saito again, the science of ecology, of ecologists, exposes the failure of the productivist project to conquer nature through technology and thus free humanity from its limitations. What Liebisch and thinkers like him made abundantly clear was that capitalism could not rise productivity any higher without sacrificing sustainability. To heedlessly push productivity higher anyway amounted to the plunder of the environment. And it's not all. It would also destroy nature's ability to renew itself. This sort of capitalism is impossible to justify or continue. Now that we've seen Marx's movement towards ecological thought, there is no other way to interpret this line about capitalism in conflict with science. So in short, science tells you there is a limit to the burden you can put on the environment. If you go beyond that limit, you sacrifice sustainability, you empty the world of its nutrients, you change the climate so that nothing can grow because you introduce radical changes in ecosystems that make them unsustainable, you don't give nature enough time to renew itself, etc. Science says there is a limit. Capitalism denies that limit. Just like today it keeps denying it, either by saying we can find ways to go around that limit, to engineer it, or to push it back, or by straight up denying climate change altogether, or that it's caused by human activity. So even in the first paragraph of the critique of the Gotha Program, Marx makes this remarkable point of how capitalism is irrational and unscientific because it discards nature's role in the labor process. The critique dismantles the Gotha Program point by point, and the first point is when they assert that labor is the source of all wealth, and all culture. Marx, right away, attacks the statement by saying that it's not just labor that is the source of wealth and culture, meaning of use value. He insists on that. Material wealth consists of use value, but also nature. Okay, nature is also the source of wealth and culture. Nature is as much the source of use values as labor, because it is the conditions for human labor. Without nature, or an access to nature, labor would be impossible. Nature is the primary source of all instruments and subjects of labor. The bourgeoisie who denies this, who only sees labor as value creating, doesn't give a shit about nature. But then not only it will reduce people to slaves, because those who take possession of nature will make others unable to work. Since labor depends on nature, then the man who possesses no other property than his labor power must, in all conditions of society and culture, be the slave of other men who have made themselves the owners of nature, of the material conditions of labor. So he can only work with their permission, hence live only with their permission. You live because your boss gives you permission to live. And since the boss can't seem to understand this, then there is something wrong with the science. Taking possession of nature means that you don't understand its role in labor, and thus the bourgeoisie is falsely ascribing, in Marx's words, supernatural creative power to labor. Like, not only you take away from people their conditions for life, you subjugate them to your will, but you also do the same to nature, which obviously means that you don't understand how the natural world works, how human beings, your own species work, and even less how the two interact and are related. So capitalism doesn't do science. By contrast, Marx's communism doesn't reject science to justify its need to maximize profit. From Liebisch and Fraz, he now argues for a rational agriculture based on the insights of the natural sciences and that doesn't cause metabolic rifts. We can say that when capitalism tries to be scientific and rational, what it is talking about is efficiency, which means it is simply, how can I satisfy my own interests with the least possible efforts and in the shortest time possible, even if that means destroying the very thing I need to live in the long term. Marx, however, aims at another way to be rational, a new rationalization, in Saito's words, as opposed to the irrationality of land use in the capitalist system outlined in Marx's Volume 3 of Das Kapital. This is Saito quoting from Volume 3. Instead of a conscious and rational treatment of the land as permanent communal property, as the inalienable condition for the existence and reproduction of the chain of human generations, we have the exploitation and the squandering of the powers of the earth. So that's from chapter 47, the chapter on ground rent, from section 5, on sharecropping and small-scale peasant ownership. So Marx is saying that in both cases, large-scale and small-scale property, you have the same irrational treatment of the land. Again, Marx isn't arguing for small-scale peasant ownership as a countermeasure to climate change. We said many times that small-scale ownership is just private property of the petty bourgeoisie. And it is ineffective because, like large-scale, it depends on the market price. In small-scale property, he says that the exploitation and squandering of the earth is the result of the lack of the resources and science needed to apply the social productive powers of labor. Since you all try to compete against one another to meet the demands of the market, you will overuse your land resources, which by virtue of being small, its resources are already way too limited to meet the demands of the market, especially if you are also competing with large-scale owners. Plus, by being isolated and in competition with other small-scale farmers, you are unlikely to use scientific knowledge effectively. Probably you will use it to increase your soil's productivity, but you will surely damage it in the process because you don't know what you are doing at this point. And you are even less likely to use it in a collaborative way with the others. A use of science so that you can best your competitor is a very bad use of science. It's the same thing with large-scale ownership. Exploitation and squandering of the earth resources results from the exploitation of these resources for the most rapid possible enrichment of the farmer and proprietor. Forced to reduce costs, capitalism will push all land owners, whether small or large scale, to overlook the demands of their soil because they'll only care about the demands of the market. And as such, they have to use the cheapest way to produce the most. And so this becomes the purpose of natural sciences under capitalism. How can I use knowledge to extract as much value as I can while giving back the strictest minimum? In other words, you try to figure out how to extract nature's force without compensation. Otherwise, you will fall short in the market. Thus, you are trapped in a vicious cycle. The market demand to raise productivity only intensifies plunder, which undercuts the foundation necessary for human development and sustainability. So from a long-term point of view, such use of the natural sciences can only result in exploitation and squandering and can never be rational. You are literally killing what you need not to just live, but to also survive. So we here go back to the commons. If it is the relentless competition for profit that makes us embrace unsustainable practices because it is each one to his private land, then the solution is to go back to communal management of the land. Only then can agriculture be rational. Saito quotes again from the Zasulich letter right after the line about how capitalism is in conflict with science. The best proof that this development of the rural commune is in keeping with the historical trend of our age is the fatal crisis which capitalist production has undergone in the European and American countries where it has reached its highest peak. A crisis that will end only when the social system is limited through the return of modern societies to the archaic type of communal property. So since the natural sciences expose capitalism's irrationality, it brings its legitimacy into a crisis. In this state of crisis, it is only the commune, the mir, and the Marx association that have what it takes to overcome it. They hold within them elements to which the modern societies in Western Europe must return. Now the question becomes, what exactly are these things that the global north must learn from the Mir and the Mark Genossenschaft so as to revive them in the present age? But before that, let's quickly summarize Saito's argument so far. Starting in 1868, Marx engaged in research into the natural sciences and communal forms of social organization, and this led to him discarding the progressive view of history and embrace a new view. Instead of emphasizing productivism and Eurocentrism, he now advocates for sustainability and equality, as well as the intrinsic link between the two. And so this link becomes the basis for a new form of rationalization. Now rationality becomes a social organization that fosters both those features. That's what Europe should now aspire to, a form of Western European society founded on principles of sustainability and equality. That's his new ideal now. Obviously, this also leads to, first, a fundamental rethinking of his assumption about the advanced or progressive nature of Western European capitalism, and second, to recognize that there are multiple roads that might lead to communism. But the most important thing is that now we have a whole new theory of what communism might look like. We so far understand that it fosters sustainability and equality, and that it is based on a return not to, but of the archaic forms of communal life, of the Marx association on a greater scale. I say return of rather than return to the Marx association, because again, we're not going back to a previous stage of history where we light rooms with candles and believe in gods and spirits. Rather, we'll make the principles that govern social life in the Germanic tribes come back. Like we've seen, the communes described by Maurer and Fraz were defined by strong internal social regulation, completely separate from the logic of commodity production found in capitalism. First, you have the same types of traditions related to production, consumption, and exchange. If you remember, we pointed to how land and goods produced from the land could not be sold outside the community. Obviously, we're not going back to closed communities that don't exchange with others, but it's the principle the principle underlying such traditions that interests us. Such traditions were supported by, quote, cyclical, steady-state economies that weren't designed to grow. The communes didn't suffer from low levels of production and poverty stemming from their underdevelopment and ignorance. Rather, at moments when they could have worked harder and longer to raise their levels of production, they simply chose not to, and they thus avoided creating the kinds of power dynamics that would evolve into domination and subservience. So this is what it's important here. Like, their economies were based on cyclical movements instead of linear movements prioritized sustainability. A cyclical economy, by definition, doesn't grow. I mean, it can, like a body that grows through cyclical processes, but just like a body, it has a limit to its growth. Even its growth is cyclical too, since it grows from the dust and eventually it goes back to dust. So these economies understood that nature imposes a certain limit to maintain itself, and as such it cannot grow indefinitely. The idea of a limitless abundance and an ever-growing productive force cannot be further away from communism. So a communist economy must too be cyclical. And as Saito mentions, when we look at these tribes, just because their economy was cyclical and didn't grow, like modern economies, it didn't mean that they suffered from shortages or poverty. As a matter of fact, those problems of shortages were rare, and poverty never seemed to bother them that much. And if those things happen, sure, they could have been avoided if they privileged growth, but their worldviews of not just seeing nature as cyclical, but also to respect nature's cyclical life, meant that they simply accept their fate, since the alternative wouldn't be sustainable. And as Saito said, they could have switched to economies that promote abundance, that promise abundance and growth, but they simply chose not to, not out of underdevelopment or ignorance, but because their worldview is predicated on sustainability. Their fear of the gods and seeing forests and lands as endowed with magic and divine powers weren't that irrational, since it compelled them to put a limit to their human activities. So that's what we need to learn from them. Not that you have to see a forest as, magical or divine, but that there are limits to what we can do with the planets, to how we interact with it or use it. So I guess now you see where this is going. It's a rejection of growth economies as the sole possibility for sustainability and social justice, meaning equality. Since an economy that is growth-oriented from the start would imply a metabolic rift, and a metabolic rift means neither sustainability nor equality. As such, communism relies on a communal society, which can only exist within a metabolic interaction with the natural world, within a sustainable metabolic interaction. So as Saito says, the stability of a communal society detached from economic growth would foster a metabolic relationship between humans and nature that would be both sustainable and equal. So there is no way around this. Before the shift, Marx viewed the lack of growth in economies as a sign of their inferiority. That's why in the early 50s, he claimed that India had no history, that it was, passive and stagnant. It's precisely because India's economy was based on the steady-state economy of its village system, which he viewed as underdeveloped. But later, he no longer takes growth as an indicator for progress. It even became the opposite, as he sees how growth-oriented economies not only destroy their own land, but also the land of others. And as such, he came to view steady-state economies not as inferior to growth economies, but as superior, actually. And not just that, but as resistance to colonial domination and the power of capital, but also as the way to achieve communism. So this can also be seen as the emancipatory power of the natural sciences. As Marx plunged into scientific studies to look for how to make sustainable economies, he realized that the same people, the same productivists looked down upon were already having such economies. By looking into ecology, he also unearthed principles of equality and respect for other cultures, looking at them as, active historical actors themselves, like the commune, that archaic social life, that archaic form of social life that was considered with no history, becomes the actor and shaper of history. Like Saito says, there is clearly a huge shift here. The commune is active in its resistance and holds the power to shape history, the power to bring about communism. So this is an affirmation of steady-state economics that stands in total opposition to Marx's writings in the 1950s. It is Marx's late period study of ecology that enabled him to see the potential in communal societies. In other words, Marx's interest in sustainability is what brought him around to seeing communes in very different ways than he had in the 1850s. So there we have it. The future communist society in Europe isn't through economic growth, but through a more rational and scientifically based management of the commons. It is grounded in the commune. And as Marx was looking for sustainable forms of economy, he had to ground economy in the natural world. The economy must respect the processes of the natural world, since it depends on them, and therefore studying nature becomes indispensable. From there, he was also immersed into ethnographic studies to compare how different human societies through the ages and in different places manage their economies in relation to their environment. From there, he understood that those who managed a sustainable economy were those who didn't advocate for growth. Those were the communes, and as such, he needs to revise his assumptions about the communes and about his views on history, and instead adopt that multilinear path for historical development. So Europe doesn't have to continue down the path of capitalism and productivism to achieve communism, and the rest of the world doesn't have to dissolve its communal property into private property, go through capitalism, and then negate that private property and then get to communism. So history isn't that linear. So this certainly was a long path, since it took more than 14 years of study to reach the conclusion that the sustainability and equality characteristic of a steady-state economy had the power to resist capital and provide the foundation for the society of the future. And thus Marx's advice for the world, not yet tainted by European ideology, is to preserve their communes, while his advice for Europe and Western societies is to consciously revive their communes so that to overcome the crisis of capitalism. Conclusion: the commune is the material condition necessary to bring about steady-state economics. But then, if these economies aren't aiming at growth, then what are they aiming at? For Marx, the only option for such economies, if they wish to be sustainable, is degrowth. In short, the communism envisioned by Marx late in his life was an egalitarian, sustainable form of degrowth economics. When Marx states that Western Europe must return modern society to a higher form of the most archaic type to overcome the dangers of capitalism, he was calling for the reinstatement there at a higher level of the communal principle of steady-state economics. So that's the ultimate goal of Marx's thought, bringing degrowth communism as a return of the commune. Again, I say return of the commune, not a return to the commune. We've already explained what it means, but here Saito provides an explanation. In Western Europe, the effort to bring about communism must consist of learning about the principles of steady-state economics as developed in communal societies and restating them in order to bring about a new form of rationalization based on sustainability and equality. One thing we must remember here is that this form of thought is not a nostalgic call to return to the village or form a commune. Marx repeatedly said that the Russian emirs, for example, must incorporate the positive aspects of the technological revolution brought about by capitalism. The revolution he sought in Western Europe would preserve the achievements of modern society, even as it called for a form of communism of the most archaic type. That is, one that uses a steady-state society as its model. This means that communism, like the Soviet Union's, founded as it was on productivism and the promotion of economic growth, will never work. The Marx we see here would even condemn such a thing as the promotion of capitalistic principles in a way that would never lead to the achievement of the society of the future. So I think it's clear what we mean by the return of the commune is the return of the communal principles of the commune. It's not to shun technology or to revert to primitivism or to tribalism. Like he says, the commune must incorporate the positive aspects of the technological revolution. He said that in his letter to Zasulich, when he told her that the Mir must seize the opportunity to develop itself technologically by learning and taking from its Western neighbors. The Soviet Union and even Mao's China went wrong by wanting to apply productivist principles as their way to transition to communism, which means that they were using capitalist principles. They still believed in the Leninist reading of Marx as someone who advocates for further productivity as the only way to communism, and as such they only succeeded in dismissing the revolutionary potential of the commune, even squashing peasants' uprising who resists their proletarianization, suppressed all dissident voices, and destroyed the same communal lifestyle that could have brought communism. And as such, Soviet communism and Maoism, they missed their chance to revive the archaic commune, and instead of using technology for its development and foster rational agriculture, they followed in the steps of their capitalist rivals. In the end, Soviet Russia, Mao's China, as well as other socialist states that followed Soviet hegemony ended up with an environment as plundered, if not more plundered, than their capitalist rivals. Thus, Soviet communism is not at all what Marx argued for. It's a communism that many critics rightfully denounced as state capitalism. It's an economic system where the state, where the government, owns and controls the means of production, factories, lands, resources, companies, but operates them for profit, often within a market framework. It's different from socialism in theory, because under socialism the idea is that production should be organized to meet social needs through collective control, often by the workers themselves, whereas in state capitalism, the state kind of acts like a capitalist. It accumulates capital, it organizes production for exchange and profit, and workers remain wage laborers rather than, collective owners. Lenin explicitly endorsed it in his pamphlet, The Tax in Kind, presenting state capitalism as a step forward towards the transition to communism. The ideology of the Soviet Union was growth-oriented. It therefore only corresponds to the young Marx's views, not his late views. We can debate whether it even corresponds to his middle views too, because Saito divides Marx's thought into three parts. The period in which he wrote the first volume of Capital corresponds to the middle Marx. It's the period in which he was trying to develop a theory for sustainable economy, but that doesn't mean that he gave up on productivism yet. The shift from productivism to degrowth happened progressively. when he realized that capitalism is causing a metabolic rift, which necessitates a sustainable economy. His first instinct is to see if we can have a sustainable economy, one that doesn't cause a metabolic rift, but somehow compatible with productivism and therefore with growth. So Das Kapital, as a theory of metabolism, only defends the thesis that capitalism cannot be sustainable. It's not yet a rejection of growth. He still contemplates the possibility of an economy that fosters both growth and sustainability. So Saito's first book, Marx's Eco-Socialism, is mostly focused on this middle Marx. He recognizes that the transition to communism isn't simply by the increase of the productive forces and inequalities which will lead to the proletarian revolution. None of that would happen or would be relevant if the metabolic rift isn't fixed. So, on top of preparing the revolution from the contradiction of capitalism within labor, we also need an economy to avoid causing a metabolic rift. So, socialism needs to also be able to repair the rift caused by capitalism and not cause one too. So this is what he has to work with during the 1860s. He still hoped that socialism would foster a sustainable growth-oriented economy, and this is what Das Kapital is supposed to achieve, at least volume 1. But after 1868, when he started to doubt the very notion of growth, there was a lot of rework and reconsideration. There was a lot to rework and to reconsider, and that's why he never finished volume 2 and 3. So Saito puts this table to summarize the evolution of Marx's political goals. First, you have his productivist period, productivism in the 1840s and 50s. So that's the period of the manuscripts of 1844, the German ideology, the Communist Manifesto, and his early views on India. So the political goal was just fostering growth with no regards to sustainability. Then in the 60s, that is his eco-socialist period, that's when he started to work on Das Kapital, and so that's where he became aware of the need for sustainability as well. So now he aims at both sustainability and growth. Then you have the post-1868 period, the 70s to his death in 1883, which is the period of degrowth communism. This is where he produced the critique of the Gotha Program and his letter to Zasulich, where he completely abandoned growth and only focuses on sustainability now. So from now on, the ultimate goal of communism is just sustainability and of course equality. So the total abandonment of growth as a political goal in the 70s is what really constitutes an epistemological break, but one that is very different from the one identified by Louis Althusser. If you remember in the video about eco-socialism, we mentioned Althusser, the French Marxist philosopher who became one of the most influential and controversial theorists of the 20th century in Marxism for his structural Marxism. He interpreted Marx through structuralist methods rather than humanism or historicist methods. So basically he argues that an epistemological break, une rupture or coupure épistémologique, it occurred in Marx between his early writings and his later writings. He means that the two belong to two different, essentially different theoretical periods or two theoretical words, separated by a sharp rupture in method, concepts, and scientific status. The term comes from French philosopher of science Gaston Bachelard, who used coupure épistémologique to describe moments in the history of science when a thinker discards earlier conceptual frameworks and creates a radical new scientific method, a new scientific problem space. And Althusser makes the same claim about Marx, but he puts the break way earlier than Saito. There is a Marx before and after 1845. So there is an early Marx, which is the Marx of 1840 to 1845. There you have works like, the economic manuscripts and philosophical manuscript of 1844. You have on the Jewish question. So Marx is still within the humanist, philosophical, and ideological framework of Hegel, of Feuerbach, and of utopian socialism. And then you have a later Marx, post-1845, starting with the German ideology and especially Das Kapital. And this moves to a more scientific analysis of society, of history, of economics based on historical materialism. And so the break is when Marx abandons ideology or abandons philosophy for science. So before the break, Marx was asking questions in philosophical terms about alienation, essence, man's nature, and after the break he reframes problems in terms of modes of production, forces and relations of production, class struggle, etc. So he also says there is a transition phase. So that's Althusser. Althusser says there is a transition phase between 1845 to 1857 before Marx's mature theory fully emerges in the Grundrisse and Capital. So this is obviously different from Saito's break. This one says that Marx went from a humanist and philosophical epistemology to an anti-humanist, structural and scientific epistemology. Saito, however, argues that the break is actually about economic growth and the progressive view of history that comes with it, and embraced a form of communism that is purely about sustainability. He says, Marx, in short, having discarded a progressive view of history, incorporated the principles of sustainability and steady-state economics from communal societies into his revolutionary thought. As a result, his vision of communism became something different from both productivism and eco-socialism. What Marx achieved at the end of his life was a vision of degrowth communism. And so this is a 100% new reading of Marx. No one before Saito at least gave this interpretation to Marx's late writings, that it is sketching a theory of degrowth communism as society's future. Engels, of course, didn't see this either, which resulted in 150 years of misunderstanding of Marx's thought, constantly depicted him as a productivist. So 150 years, 1 century and a half of Marx's scholarship, and no one suspected that his thinking was aiming at a theory of degrowth. As a result, for a century and a half, Marxism was thought to be incompatible with ecology or be used to analyze environmental problems. But as Saito is showing, Marxism may be the only theoretical framework that is efficient in combating climate change, as it sees the climate crisis as stemming from the ultimate contradictions within capitalism, and the crisis of the Anthropocene worsened to its present state. Communism doesn't just expose capitalism as exploitation of workers, but also as exploitation of the natural world. And so communism then is essentially ecological and egalitarian. But for communism to be coherent, it must discard growth altogether. And so this is perhaps the most controversial aspect of Saito's claim. Again, those 150 years have only made growth ubiquitous in Marx's thought. So much so that it seems that Marxism and degrowth are inherently irreconcilable, like mixing oil with water. So let's go again through the conventional understanding of Marxism. Communism imagined a future society brought about when the worker seized the means of production and, once free, unleashed the forces of productivity and technology to provide themselves with affluent lifestyles. Such a society would be incompatible with degrowth. So, since this remained the conventional view, it was taken for granted from the start that communism is a growth and productivist economy. Therefore, even knowing about his later writings on the natural sciences, the studies of the commune and ecology, etc., no one really thought of putting these insights together. At best, researchers simply welcome works that show Marx's break with Eurocentrism, since it makes Marx more politically correct, like Kevin Anderson's work, for example, Marx at the Margins, which we discussed last week. That's an example. Likewise, with works relevant to ecology, you have works revealing an environmental Marx. It is acclaimed and praised, but only as, burnishing of Marx's PC bona fides, meaning Marx's reputation or credibility as being in line with what we now call political correctness, progressive, socially conscious positions, and also ecological positions. Saito even mentions his book, Marx's Eco-Socialism, which was received by Marxist scholars in the same way. So all of these works made Marx seem more in tune with contemporary progressive values, hence more PC, more politically correct. So to portray Marx as a non-Eurocentric environmentalist simply adds to this, to his progressive credentials, but without challenging the deeper taboo against degrowth, the deliberate reduction of economic production for ecological sustainability. And so what was the point? After all, since they are incompatible with the conventional view of communism. From the start, it is taken for granted that Marxism doesn't have the ability to accept degrowth as a viable option, so we can, produce countless works to rehabilitate Marx as a progressive from the moral point of view and environmentalist. He'll only be considered a bad one or one that contradicts himself. But the contradiction only holds if we accept this conventional interpretation of Marx, that he's essentially a growth theorist. So far, no one dared to challenge that interpretation and to propose degrowth communism. Saito himself says that in his Marxist eco-socialism, he didn't dare to propose degrowth and stopped at noting how to call for a sustainable economic development was part of Marxist eco-socialist thought. Probably because, well, that book was his doctoral thesis and he didn't want to be too controversial. So anyway, so to propose degrowth communism is actually to go against the heavy burden placed on Marx's legacy, that is, of productivism. To posit this means to recognize that increasing productivity itself is destructive, and this can be seen as a complete dismissal for Marxism, and with it the hope for the working class to emancipate itself. Indeed, it becomes difficult to accept that you have to renounce productivity increase when you've placed the hopes of the entire working class on it. If you believe that working class emancipation lies in increasing productivity, when someone comes along and says increasing productivity is bad, well, it is lived as a betrayal, right? You just took away the working class's only chance at freedom, at equality, and a decent life. So you can say that it's the same reaction when environmentalists blame third world countries for polluting, right? Like these countries, they see in economic growth their only chance to get their peoples out of poverty, and here you are telling them to abandon such promises. So just like environmentalism was an enemy for many third world countries, degrowth is also an enemy for Marxism because it robs the proletariat from its only chance at emancipation. However, degrowth communism isn't a rejection of Marxism but the full embrace of it, because Marx understood that the working class emancipation can only occur when the natural world doesn't get destroyed. There is no proletariat emancipation without ecology. Thus, the studies that Marx took up in his later life, his study of non-Western and pre-capitalist communal societies, is not just something we can only use for biographical purposes or to make Marx seem as someone who was sympathetic to ecology and non-Westerners for political correctness purposes. It's not evidence that we should revise the way we imagine him or make him more PC and palatable to today's audiences. The radicality of rejecting productivism and Eurocentrism, the embrace of the studies of the natural sciences, that was what allowed for a coherent theory of emancipation and of revolution. So he says it's evidence that Marx reached the point of imagining degrowth communism as a project that might truly topple Western European capitalism. The above analysis is not meant simply to clarify the precise nature of communism sketched out near the end of Marx's life. It's meant to show that the place Marx reached allowed him to see an entirely new idea come into being, one that no one else had ever articulated before, a new weapon with the power to construct a whole new future for society, a weapon called degrowth communism. So, degrowth communism as an anti-capitalist revolutionary project. Is it far-fetched as an argument? Well, Saito thinks not, and he is convinced that this is where Marx's thought was leaning towards. So, a proof of this, he argues, can be found again in the critique of the Gotha Program, in the famous paragraph that ends with the slogan, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. So here's the passage. So, in a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not only a means of life but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. So, if you remember what we said earlier, the critique was directed towards Lassallean dogmas, which Marx criticized one by one, and so this passage comes from his critique of the third point in the program. So that point is saying that the emancipation of labor requires three things. First, the promotion of the instruments of labor to the common property of society, the promotion of the cooperative regulation of the total labor, and three, a fair distribution of the process of the proceeds of labor. So these three demands are completely vague, and Marx attacks them precisely on that point. But here, what will interest us is the third point, the one about the fair distribution of the proceeds of labor. Now, the proceeds of labor, we don't know what that is exactly. Is the product of labor or the value of labor? But let's say that for the sake of argument that we mean the distribution of wealth. Marx argues that already Lassalle needs to explain what he means by fair, since the bourgeoisie already claims that its distribution system is fair. But ultimately, he seems to argue for the principle that each gets according to their contribution. But that at best simply corresponds to the lower phase of communism, the socialist phase that we mentioned earlier. Production is collectively organized, but distribution is still based on individual contribution. People get back from society an amount proportional to the labor that they put in. This, for Marx, is still a kind of bourgeois right, because it treats everyone according to an equal standard, which is labor time, while ignoring differences in needs and capacities. So this is contrasted by the higher stage of communism, which is described in the passage that we've quoted, and in that stage, society can abandon this narrow framework of bourgeois right and adopt the principle from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. And Marx's aim is to show that fair distribution isn't a matter of abstract justice, like you just get what is fair based on an abstract moral notion like merit, for example, or contribution. But it depends on the modes of production. The higher phase slogan is not a moral maxim, but the economic expression of a society where abundance and human development make an unconditional distribution possible. You don't get access to material goods and services because you earn them. Such views disregard your abilities and needs. You just have access to them because the mode of production no longer is threatened by scarcity. Thus, you get an unconditional access to what you need. And so this stage is possible only after a long period of development, when the division between mental and manual labor disappears. Individuals are no longer subordinated to a fixed division of labor, the productive forces have greatly expanded, and human capacities have fully developed. But we've already said that the expansion of productive forces has a different meaning, and that is because of the phrase that we stressed, cooperative wealth. So it's a phrase that only appears in that line from the critique of the Gotha Program. Marx never uses it anywhere else. So it's like a new concept, and Saito argues that by analyzing that expression, we understand that the productive forces that Marx talks about here, it's in reality in a degrowth context. If we understand what Marx means by cooperative wealth, we'll understand that the nature of revolution in Western Europe is degrowth communism. So, cooperative wealth is a wealth whose nature has transformed because of the mode of production of such wealth was transformed as well. You change the nature of the mode of production, you also change the nature of the wealth produced by that mode of production. Cooperative wealth is the kind of wealth you get once you transform the modes of production in such a way that it's not dominated by capital. So it's the organization of production in an anti-capitalist paradigm. Under capitalism, wealth is primarily understood as accumulated value, commodities, capital, money, produced under conditions of exploitation. Labor is atomized and mediated through exchange, so even though production is collective, in reality, factory, social division of labor, the results appear as private property owned by capitalists. So once the enslaving subordination of individuals under the division of labor is overcome, people's productive powers are no longer mediated through capital, but are consciously organized. And so it's here where labor becomes free, creative activity. So in this condition, Marx says that wealth is no longer measured by exchange value, but by the expansion of human capacities and communal life. In other words, wealth no longer has a quantitative meaning, like in GDP, for example, but a qualitative meaning, like in HDI, the Human Development Index. So wealth is now determined by the well-being, the happiness, the freedom of people, because it counts the shared capacities, resources, and achievements of freely associated individuals. That's what cooperative wealth means. It's not private accumulation. Basically, it's when people are liberated from the domination of capital and regain their ability to labor freely. So the Leninist interpretation takes cooperative wealth as also quantitative. It's good that wealth is produced collectively by free associated individuals, so it's cooperative in the sense that people cooperate together to generate wealth. Therefore, this wealth, the surplus value produced by labor, doesn't become profit. It doesn't go to the pocket of the capitalist who privately owns the means of production. Instead, that wealth belongs to everyone who produces it. But the Leninists also require that this wealth is also material abundant wealth. They take this wealth as the result of the increase of productive forces in the conventional sense. You produce more, infinitely more. In that sense, they are still productivists. What Saito suggests, however, is that the interpretation of Leninists of cooperative wealth is wrong, because it takes cooperative wealth to mean the wealth of the cooperative. If we understand cooperative wealth like that, we're going back to the Marx of the 40s, whereas we are in the Marx of the 70s. If we say it's the wealth of the cooperative, then Saito says the phrase would possess, the following meaning. It would mean the sense of the phrase would become something like, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual and all the springs of wealth flow more abundantly for the cooperative, a passage that sounds like nothing other than a further celebration of productivism. So it would simply mean that by organizing labor through cooperatives, you'll be able to produce way more wealth, so much abundance that it will no longer make sense to withhold resources from anyone, and distribution will have to be according to principle of the higher stage. And so this interpretation is very unlikely, considering that we are talking about the Marx of the 70s. So how to interpret that? Well, we know that according to Marx, production under capitalism can only be considered progressive towards socialism when it's just about increasing an individual's income and assets. When workers make demands in capitalist modes of production, they usually go as far as asking for higher wages and assets. This means that the fundamental mode of production is still the same, a boss who owns the means of production and exploits you, but exploits you less. And as such, the wealth that you produced is still considered his. It is still privately managed instead of commonly managed. In communism, however, that production that was privately managed will transform into something that allows everyone to jointly manage. Wealth becomes cooperative here. And what's the word we've been using when it's about communal management since the beginning of this chapter 2 episodes ago? Well, it is the commons. Cooperative wealth, according to Saito, doesn't mean more wealth or abundance, but a return of the commons. It's the kind of wealth that you get from managing the commons. In the German text of the critique of the Gotha Program, that's what's translated as cooperative wealth is this. I'm going to try to pronounce it right. So, der Genossenschaftliche Reichtum. So, Reichtum or Reichtum means wealth, and the other word, Genossenschaftliche, means cooperative. But wait, we have met that word before, haven't we? It's the same word that is used for association, like in the Marx association of the Germanic tribes. Like Saito says, the word is a bit ambiguous and can mean many different things, and Marx used it from time to time before he started reading about the Marx association. So the German word Genossenschaftlich carries with it the connotation of both cooperatives as understood as unions and cooperatives as understood as free associations. And he tended to use it in phrases like cooperative production and cooperative mode of production. So the term cooperative, Genossenschaftlich, can mean union and free association, and when it is used in that sense in relation to expressions like cooperative production and cooperative mode of production, it's probably in a sense that is close to a Leninist. It's undeniable that Marx used that term before to mean the wealth of the cooperative. But when we try to make sense of that word in relation to his post-1868 research studies and his writings, either it's going to be at odds with those studies, or it gained another meaning. The fact is, the origin of this particular use of the word Genossenschaftlich is very likely different from what it had been in his earlier writings. Why might it be? So this then will depend on whether we take that word to mean cooperative in its Leninist sense, or by it he means the Mark Genossenschaft of the Germanic tribes. So the debate here is whether Genossenschaftliche means the commons or the cooperative's wealth, because both do not operate in the same way or for the same goal. A cooperative, even though it is a cooperative, it's still a company. It still tries to maximize what is equivalent to profits in a private company, meaning a surplus. The difference between the two starts at ownership. A private company is owned by individuals or shareholders who invest capital. From this, decisions are made by the owners, the board of directors or managers, with voting powers proportional to shares. And as such, the goal of a private company is to maximize profit for shareholders. A cooperative or a co-op is owned collectively by its members, workers, consumers, producers, or residents, who each typically have one vote regardless of capital invested. Decisions are made democratically by the members, like worker members or consumer members, and its goals are different. It's not profit-oriented, but need-oriented. A co-op exists to provide benefits to its members, fair wages, affordable goods, stable markets, shared services, etc., not to maximize profit for outside investors. But it still needs a surplus to reinvest. That surplus is like profit, except that instead of going to shareholders, often in proportion to their ownership stakes, surpluses are redistributed to members, reinvested in the co-op, or used for community benefit, like education, community projects, or solidarity funds. It's way better than private companies for sure, but they are still productivist, meaning that they are growth-oriented. The commons, however, based on what Marx knew of the Marx Association, are obviously not growth-oriented. Cooperative wealth seems to be a mistranslation. It's communal wealth that would be a better and fair candidate. An obvious possible origin for the term, as it's used in the critique of the Gotha Program, is Marktgenossenschaft, the term for the communal society organization of ancient German peoples. There's a high probability that Marx's use of the term here came out of his concurrent research into communes, including, as we've seen, Marktgenossenschaft. If this is the case, then we should understand the term less as cooperative wealth than as communal wealth. It seems quite natural to thus read the sentence as referring to the cooperative management of wealth understood as communal. But another way, can't we read this passage overall, put another way, can't we read this passage overall as stating that the societal cooperation fostered by communism is modeled on the management of the communal wealth in the Marktgenossenschaft, and as such should be reinstated in Western Europe as well. It should go without saying that the abundance referred to here is of a different order from the abundance created from endless unchecked production. This is a radical abundance, one produced via the commons. So, like we said, the term abundance too gained a new meaning for Marx. It is not abundance that can be achieved by endless production. It's another kind of abundance, which, like I said, we'll see in the 6th chapter of the book. But the point is, if we take cooperative wealth to mean communal wealth, a wealth produced not in a context of growth, then that wealth is one produced in a context of degrowth instead. That being said, we must admit that the fact Marx left behind no piece of writing laying out exactly what his vision of degrowth communism might be, forces us to speculate. But if we just stop at the usual scholarly interpretation of his last writings, then there is no relevance of Marx in combating the climate crisis. But we've also seen that all solutions to combat the crisis through non-Marxist frameworks don't work either. Obviously, all growth-oriented policies fail because growth and ecology are incompatible, which only leaves degrowth as a viable option. But we've seen that degrowth circles back to capitalism, so to growth, if it doesn't want to be associated with communism, or the reverse. Like we've seen, many Marxists themselves reject degrowth. Like Saito says, even the ones who criticize the Soviet Union have not been able to free themselves completely from productivism's shackles. So from the origins of the socialist movement to the present, Marxism has remained bound to productivism, becoming itself almost like an opium to Marxists, a religious belief that human emancipation is tied to the expansion of the productive forces. Like Saito says, even critics of Soviet-style industrial gigantism have really been able to shed this presupposition. Marxist orthodoxy is then lied to the very logic of unfettered productivity that has driven the climate breakdown. So the only chance left then is degrowth communism, and we have enough material from the mega project relating to Marx's research into the communes and the natural sciences to posit, even if it is speculation, that communism may be the only economic framework compatible with degrowth and thus the only adequate response to the crisis of the Anthropocene. So persisting in the conventional view, that Marxism is incompatible with degrowth and ecology not only led to the stagnation of present-day Marxism, but also the deepening of the worldwide environmental crisis. So recognizing the shift in Marxist thought and grasping its implication opens a whole field of possibility for new fertile and innovative take on Marxism and develop the theory even further. Marx died before finishing his work, so it is a challenge to contemporary scholars to engage in reconstruction, meaning an interpretive task that requires both fidelity to Marx's insights and innovation in light of contemporary realities. So productivism cannot be seriously contemplated anymore. It would therefore do a big service to Marxism to abandon it, like Marx did at the end of his life. There is no longer any room left for championing productivism, and solutions like decoupling and eco-socialism are respectively impossible to put in practice and are insufficient. So separating economic growth from ecological impact, we've seen from chapter 1, has proven intractable. All projects of green growth, whether they stem from capitalist or socialist economies, they don't work in the face of the crisis. And so now it has taken existential proportions, threatening not just human life, but all life on Earth. So degrowth communism isn't just one alternative among others, it's the alternative on which humanity's survival depends. So Saito frames this as Marx's last wish, expressed in his Zasulich letter, where he entertained the possibility that the Russian commune might serve as a basis for a non-capitalist transition to communism, bypassing the destructive development path of Western Europe. So that moment, that wish to get to communism without going through productivism, marks the culmination of Marxist theoretical reorientation away from linear industrial teleology and towards a recognition of communal, sustainable, and locally embedded modes of production. So that Marx died before integrating these insights into Capital, because of an interruption in his intellectual path, hence because he died, but it is still recoverable. If the Anthropocene is to be survived, the task is not merely to read Marx differently, but to complete the theoretical work he could not finish. So this means that it is up to us to articulate a vision of degrowth communism, a project that would combine Marx's critique of capitalism's metabolic rift with an explicit rejection of growth as an economic imperative. So to sum up and to finish this chapter, the theoretical shift Marx underwent near the end of his life ended up being too big, and he died before he could apply it to the unpublished sections of Capital. But the cue we need to create the future society we want is buried there in the territory just beyond the ideas he was able to develop during his lifetime. For this reason, in order to face the crisis of the Anthropocene, we must develop Marx's critique of capitalism and complete what he started in Capital by fully theorizing what degrowth communism might look like, creating a major new analysis adequate to this new age. So, that's it for today. We finished the chapter, Marx in the Anthropocene. So fourth chapter is now over. Next week we will jump into the fifth. So the fifth chapter of Degrowth Communism, of Slowdown. It is the wishful thinking known as accelerationism. And so the fifth chapter, this one is going to be about another view of communism that is still, present today, and it is still productivist. This one is extremely productivist. It's known as accelerationism, and we will talk about that next week before going into the details of what degrowth communism would actually look like. So next week we are going to start to talk about accelerationism, and then the week after, the sixth chapter, we're going to start reading the chapter on communist abundance. Well, first of all, there is that chapter going to be divided into two parts. First, there is the part on capitalist scarcity, and then the part on communism's abundance. And then the chapter after that is going to be about what degrowth communism will actually look like in details. Okay, so we're going to stop here. Thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. Subscribe, leave a comment, share.